Picture this. Jerusalem, 1947. A city just fractured by conflict. You've got Arab and Jewish communities clashing. The British are struggling to keep a lid on things.
Yeah, it's a really tense, volatile backdrop. You can't overstate that.
And right in the middle of all that chaos, something, well, extraordinary surfaces. These ancient texts that would basically challenge and reshape how we understand religious history.
Exactly. And it's crucial to remember this wasn't just some, quiet archaeological dig. These scrolls pop up in a place already simmering with political and religious tension.
Right.
In that context, it heavily influenced how they were first treated, how they were interpreted, everything.
Absolutely. So today we're doing a deep dive into precisely that, the discovery and those very first attempts to figure out what the Dead Sea Scrolls actually were.
Imagine holding documents potentially thousands of years old. A direct link, maybe, to the roots of Judaism and Christianity.
That's like finding a lost chapter, isn't it? A
Yeah.
completely missing piece of religious thought.
It really is. And our main source for this initial period, it's Edmund Wilson's account. It's fantastic, really.
Yeah, his work gives such a great journalistic, historical view. Captures the immediate buzz, the confusion, the evolving ideas as they happened.
It lets us witness it almost firsthand, doesn't it? The birth of this huge scholarly revelation.
So for you listening, this is a chance to kind of be there at the beginning, to feel those early aha moments, or maybe even the wait what moments as scholars grappled with finds nobody had ever seen before.
And you see how the politics, the initial checks, the different opinions, how all that played a part in shaping that first understanding.
So our mission today in this deep dive is basically to pull out the key insights, the surprising bits about the discovery and those early interpretations.
And we'll need to navigate that tricky landscape, the politics, the religion of the time, trying to sort early guesses from, more solid assessments.
Okay, let's get into it. Jerusalem, 1947. Wilson paints this picture of a real pressure cooker.
Yeah, the British trying to manage things. Jewish resistance groups were active. Some pretty grim stuff happening. Jewish areas under tight military control.
And that whole intense environment directly shaped the very first transaction involving the scrolls.
Yeah, it's fascinating how those existing tensions were, exploited. The Syrian merchant who dealt with the Bedouins, he played on their fears.
How so?
Suggested selling to a Jew might be some kind of trap. He even brought up Palestinian law, saying antiquities had to be handed over to the government.
Wow. So pure manipulation based on the political climate.
Pretty much. And that manipulation dictated where those first scrolls ended up.
Right. So the story goes, 5 manuscripts and some fragments get left with this Syrian merchant.
And he takes them to the metropolitan of the Syrian Orthodox monastery.
And the price, like 50 pounds or something?
Reportedly, yeah, around 50 pounds. Which just shows, doesn't it, how little they grasped the actual historical value at that point.
Incredible. Just pocket change for what they were.
Precisely. So the metropolitan, naturally, he's curious, wants expert opinions.
First stop.
He consults the Syrian patriarch of Antioch, who was pretty conservative, dated them maybe 3 centuries old, max.
Okay, so not exactly ancient history yet?
No, but he did suggest talking to a Hebrew professor at the American University in Beirut.
Good idea. Except
the professor was on vacation. Just bad timing,
So the Metropolitan thinks, okay, I'll figure this out myself.
Back in Jerusalem, yeah. He asks a friend, someone in the Department of Antiquities, for books on the Hebrew alphabet.
And the friend's reaction?
Skepticism. Apparently told the Metropolitan it was a waste of time, the scrolls weren't worth anything. Total dismissal.
Ouch. But he did bring someone else.
He did. He brought a Hebrew expert from the new city, a guy named Tovia Wechsler, to the monastery.
Okay, Wechsler. Now here's where it gets a bit fuzzy, right? The timeline.
Yeah, there's a discrepancy. The Metropolitan remembered it as late September. Wechsler himself, he recalled July.
What does that little detail tell us? Just foggy memory or something more?
Well, it certainly highlights the human element, doesn't it? Memory's tricky, especially years later, and maybe colored by what happened afterwards. Personal interpretations creep in.
And Wechsler's assessment.
Yeah.
It wasn't exactly what the Metropolitan was hoping for, was it?
Not at all. He looked at them and reportedly said something like, even if you covered the table in banknotes, it wouldn't match the value of real 2,000-year-old scrolls.
So immediate doubt about the age and the whole Dead Sea Cave story.
Right. He was very skeptical. He even came up with his own theory.
Based on what?
Based on the ink, apparently. Variations in the ink used for corrections and additions. He thought they'd been used a lot by a poor community and only recently abandoned.
Interesting. Leading him to conclude
that they were stolen. stolen from a Palestinian synagogue during the Arab anti-Jewish riots back in 1929.
Okay, so he's trying to use physical evidence. The ink, the wear, becomes to a completely different conclusion.
Exactly. Though, credit where it's due, he did spot something important. He recognized an Isaiah text that was slightly different from the standard Masoretic text.
Ah, that is significant, even if he maybe didn't grasp the full implications then.
It was a crucial early observation, yeah. But then there's the issue with the second document he looked at.
What was that?
Wexler identified it as a Haftarah, readings from the prophets used in synagogue services.
Okay.
But here's the thing. No Haftarah scrolls like that have ever been found among the actual Dead Sea Scrolls. It's another contradiction.
So what happened there?
Well, the Metropolitan insisted Wexler must have just been mistaken, maybe confused it with a regular Torah scroll he showed him separately.
This really highlights how little they knew back then, doesn't it?
Yeah.
About the sheer variety of texts that might exist beyond the standard biblical books.
Absolutely. It underscores the challenge of identification, especially since, as we found out later, there were all these non-biblical scrolls, completely unknown texts at the time.
Some people even suggested Wexler mistook one of those unique texts for just a modern synagogue scroll.
But Wexler apparently wasn't having it. He used that famous analogy, the camel and the cat, basically saying, look, I know the difference.
Huh. So this disagreement just lingered. Shows how tough it was to interpret something so new with the limited knowledge they had.
It really does. And adding to the confusion, the American School of Oriental Research later found that the only Hebrew manuscript actually in the monastery library was a relatively modern Torah.
So that makes Wexler's account and the Metropolitan's counter account even more difficult to pin down. We're left with a slightly blurry picture of exactly what he saw.
A very blurry picture.
Okay, so while the Metropolitan is getting these confusing opinions, something major is happening politically across town.
Right. November 29th, 1947. The UN votes on the partition of Palestine.
And the atmosphere must have been electric. Incredibly tense. How did that affect the scroll story?
Directly. That vote, the tension that followed, it pushed Professor Eliezer Sukenik into action.
Even though it was dangerous.
Extremely dangerous. His own son, Yigal Yadin, who was a soldier but also an archaeologist, gave him conflicting advice.
As a soldier, don't go. As an archaeologist, you have to go.
And Sukenik went.
He decided to risk it. Traveled to Bethlehem.
And this was crucial, wasn't it?
Absolutely pivotal.
Yeah.
Sukenik managed to acquire the second batch of scrolls, 3 manuscripts plus fragments, though one piece was missing.
Yeah, and the timing.
The very next day, open warfare basically breaks out. Arabs start trying to isolate Jewish communities, ambushing vehicles, attacks. It got bad fast.
So Sukenik literally got these scrolls just as things exploded.
Right. Against this backdrop of violence escalating by the hour, it just shows the dedication, doesn't it? Pursuing these finds even when facing immense personal risk.
Absolutely. And with Jerusalem now basically a war zone, power cuts everywhere. Examining these things must have been nearly impossible.
Yeah, but Dr. Trevor and Dr. Brownlee at the American School of Oriental Research, they were determined.
What did they do? Got out the kerosene lamps, and they started comparing everything they had, comparing the scrolls to the Nash Papyrus, which was the oldest known Hebrew biblical text at the time.
Working by lamplight.
By midnight, they'd reached a pretty stunning conclusion. Then this new Isaiah scroll, it was at least as old as the Nash Papyrus, maybe even older.
Wow. Imagine that moment. The excitement.
It's been incredible. So the next morning, the power comes back on, thankfully, and they start the huge task of photographing the entire Isaiah scroll, all 54 columns.
That must take in hours.
Took them right up until noon, which led to this rather lovely scene, a communal lunch with the Syrian monks. The Metropolitan was apparently overjoyed.
A moment of shared discovery and, I guess, camaraderie amidst all the fighting. That's quite something.
It is. And the Metropolitan, who'd been a bit secretive about where the scrolls actually came from, he apparently opened up to the American scholars then, shared his joy that they'd confirmed his belief in their antiquity.
And we shouldn't forget the actual physical work involved here. These things were falling apart right now.
Oh, absolutely. Many were in fragments. They had to carefully piece them together. And initially, they were just using adhesive tape, Scotch tape, basically.
Amazing. And Metropolitan trusted them with more scrolls after this.
He did. He clearly felt confident in their assessment and their care.
But the fighting was getting worse.
Yeah, the escalating conflict soon forced everyone's hand. The Metropolitan told Dr. Trevor that one of the monks, Brother Boutros, had taken all the manuscripts out of Palestine for safety.
Which the Americans had advised, right?
They had. And shortly after that, the American scholars themselves had to leave the country, too. It was just getting too dangerous.
Then the British mandate ends.
Yeah.
Just chaos.
Complete chaos. The British just pulled out. They didn't transfer control, didn't legalize any local militia, just left.
Leaving Jews and Arabs to fight it out. And the neighboring Arab states getting involved.
Exactly. The old city, including the monastery where the scrolls had been, came under bombardment.
And
Tragically, Brother Boutros Somi, the monk who had likely helped handle the scrolls, was killed in the shelling. The monastery itself suffered significant damage.
Such a devastating period. And amidst all this, Metropolitan Samuel eventually leaves too.
Yes, in the autumn, persuaded by Dr. Burroughs, another scholar involved, he decided to take the scrolls he still had to America for safety.
When did he arrive in the U.S.?
Early 1949. The hope was that the American school arranging for publication would help facilitate an eventual sale of the scrolls.
Okay, so the scrolls are scattered, some are safe, some are potentially still in danger. But the big questions are starting to emerge. Who wrote these things? Why were they hidden?
And the first really strong lead points towards the Essenes.
The Essenes, a Jewish sect we know about from ancient writers, right?
Hmm.
Pliny the Elder, Josephus, Philo.
Exactly. First-century writers. And what makes the Essene connection so compelling right away is Pliny.
What did Pliny say?
Pliny the Elder specifically locates an Essene community living on the western shore of the Dead Sea.
Which is precisely where the scrolls and the ruins, Qumran, were found.
Precisely. That geographical pinpoint is a crucial early link.
The other writers, Philo and Josephus, they give us more detail about Essene life.
They do. They describe this community living communally, sharing property. They apparently rejected marriage, although there are some slightly different takes on that between Philo and Josephus.
Okay. What else?
Philo mentions their commitment to pacifism. They focused on farming, peaceful crafts, rejected slavery, big emphasis on cleanliness, ritual bathing.
And their religious practices were distinct too.
Very distinct. Their Sabbath observance was unique. Notably, they didn't perform animal sacrifices, which actually got them barred from the main temple courtyard in Jerusalem.
So they were kind of outsiders within Judaism itself. What about their beliefs say about the afterlife?
That's interesting too. Unlike the Sadducees, who didn't believe in immortality, the Essenes did. They believed the soul was immortal, came from heaven, got trapped in the body, and was freed by death.
And they had a vision of a kind of paradise for the virtuous.
Yeah, a place beyond the ocean, free from bad weather, snow, heat. A pleasant afterlife.
And later writers added more.
Yeah, see Julius Solanus writing later, maybe 3rd century AD. He emphasized that only the chaste and innocent could join the Essene order. Suggests pretty strict entry requirements based on morality.
There's also that point about interpreting Pliny, isn't there? About why they lived near the Dead Sea. Dr. Albright's idea.
Right. Pliny says they avoided the shore usque qua nocent as far as it is harmful. The traditional reading was about the Dead Sea's environment being bad.
But Albright suggested.
Albright argued it wasn't about the sea being harmful, but about the Essenes fleeing the evils of the wider society. They were distancing themselves from corruption.
And he pointed out the Northwest Shore wasn't uninhabitable, right? There were resorts there before 48.
Exactly. So it wasn't necessarily a desolate wasteland they were forced into. It reinforces the idea of a deliberate separation based on their values. The location was part of their chosen isolation.
Which brings us to the actual site, near the caves. Qumran, Wilson describes the Dead Sea landscape as pretty desolate, forbidding.
Yeah, very stark. He mentions a friend remarking, only monotheism could result from this. That sense of austerity.
How might that stark environment connect with the Essene worldview we've been discussing?
Well, you could see how that kind of austere landscape might reinforce their sense of separation, their focus on spiritual purity over worldly things. It sort of fits the image.
Now, about the Essenes and marriage, while the main sources say they rejected it, some texts found among the scrolls themselves, like the Damascus document, seem to allow it.
That's right. It suggests a more complex picture, maybe different groups within the broader Essene movement or an evolution over time. The Damascus document mentions marriage, but with like a 3-year probation for wives.
So our understanding is still developing as more texts are studied.
Absolutely. Which leads us nicely to Father Roland de Vaux. He was central to the actual digging at Qumran.
And Wilson's description of him is amazing. Not your typical French priest at all, compared to Jacques Cousteau.
Yeah. Intelligent, skilled, tenacious, really efficient, a dynamic figure.
Piercing eyes, distinctive beard, always smoking. A natural storyteller. There was even that false rumor he'd been an actor.
Right. Speaks to his personality, but he wasn't just charismatic. He was tough. He wasn't afraid of the hard physical work of archaeology.
Camping at the site.
Mm.
And didn't he eat a hyena?
Huh, yes. The story goes they shot one and he cooked it up, said it was delicious, like wild boar. Gives you a sense of the man.
And he was physically capable, too, exploring those dangerous caves, like the one where the big manuscript haul was found, the one a Bedouin found chasing a partridge.
Exactly. He was agile, hands-on, a key figure in physically uncovering the Essene connection at Qumran.
So you have the scrolls being found, and then the archaeological work at Qumran starting up, led by people like DeVox, and the pieces start fitting together.
It becomes increasingly clear, doesn't it, that these texts, this site, they likely represent the literature and home of this Dead Sea sect, the Essenes.
Filling this huge gap in our knowledge, that period between the Old and New Testaments, the intertestamental period.
And the potential impact was recognized early on. Albright, a giant in the field, he predicted the scrolls could revolutionize our approach to the beginnings of Christianity.
He even later said the basic material of our New Testament will now have to be rewritten. That's a huge claim.
It's profound. And it wasn't just about Christian origins. Albright also saw a massive impact on rabbinic studies.
And beyond the biblical texts, what about those other related writings, the Apocrypha?
André Dupont-Sommer, a key French scholar, he highlighted this. He argued the scrolls suddenly made sense of passages in pre-Christian apocryphal literature that had been, indecipherable before.
So this whole intertestamental period suddenly snaps into sharper focus.
Exactly. It was a time when ideas about a savior Messiah were becoming more prominent. Apocalyptic literature, visions, symbols revealing the past and future was flourishing.
And these new revelations often weren't attributed to the actual authors, right? Charles noted they were often written under the name of older prophets or patriarchs.
Right, pseudonymously. As the Jewish law became seen as the final word, attributing new revelations to figures like Enoch or Moses gave them authority.
The Book of Daniel is a classic example of that apocalyptic style, even though its place in the Bible differs between Jewish and Christian traditions.
And interpreting this stuff is complex for scholars. You have these fantastical visions, but they often relate to real historical events, all seen through this lens of God's divine plan.
Now, Dupont-Sommer, you mentioned him. He dug into the Habakkuk commentary, one of the scrolls. What did he find?
He dated it pretty specifically, around 41 BC, and he tried to identify the key figures mentioned in the commentary. They're never named, mind you.
Who were they?
The main ones are the teacher of righteousness, seen as a persecuted priest leading this new covenant community, and his antagonist, the wicked priest, also called the prophet of falsehood, or man of falsehood.
There was conflict between them.
A major conflict, according to Dupont-Sommer's reading. The wicked priest persecutes the teacher of righteousness.
But the wicked priest gets his comeuppance in the end.
That's the interpretation, yes. Divine punishment awaits him.
Okay, let's try to connect this to the bigger picture. The Old Testament, early Christianity. We have the famous suffering servant passage in Isaiah 53.
Which Christians have traditionally seen as a prophecy of Jesus, right?
But Dupont-Sommer had a radical idea about 2nd Isaiah itself.
He suggested that maybe 2nd Isaiah wasn't as early as traditionally thought, that it might actually date from the same period as this Dead Sea sect's literature.
Wow. That would really shake things up, blurring the lines between prophecy and contemporary description.
Absolutely. He even floated the idea that the return from the Babylonian exile might have started a new phase for the sect, and figures like Jesus and John the Baptist were, in a way, symptoms of this later phase.
He saw a possible progression. The teacher of righteousness' rebellion, then maybe Essene pacifism, then Jesus has turned the other cheek, as different ways Jewish groups adapted to defeat an occupation.
It's a way of looking at the evolving concept of God, too, maybe moving from the more vengeful depictions in parts of the Old Testament towards the God of mercy and love emphasized later.
And you see echoes of this emphasis on meekness and mercy in other texts from that era.
Definitely. Things like the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, dated maybe late 2nd century BC, they sound remarkably like parts of the Gospels in their focus on forgiveness and inner morality.
Suggesting perhaps a broader shift in some Jewish thought, away from resentment towards oppressors and towards what? Moral salvation. Faith in a less militant God.
Possibly. It's a complex evolution, and it might help explain some of the apparent tensions in Jesus's own reported teachings. The contrast between bringing a sword and preaching peace, or the different promises to the poor in spirit versus the meek.
This brings us to a really sensitive point Wilson raises, potential bias among the scholars themselves.
Yeah, he asks the question, could the religious backgrounds of the scholars, Christian priests, rabbis, those trained in specific traditions, have unconsciously shaped how they viewed the scrolls historically?
He suggests maybe a fear on the Jewish side about anything that might weaken the authority of the standard Masoretic text.
Or a reluctance to see Jesus' movement as growing directly out of a specific branch of Judaism, like the Essenes.
On the Christian side.
Perhaps a concern about anything that might seem to compromise the uniqueness of Christ, showing parallels or precursors to his teachings or role.
And Wilson speculates that these biases, maybe subconscious, might have fueled some attempts to date the scrolls much later.
Right, attempts by scholars like Solomon Zeitlin, who tried to connect them to the Karaites way later, in the 8th century AD.
Or G.R. Driver, who consistently argued for a later date, maybe 1st or 2nd century AD, minimizing any direct link to Christian origins.
These alternative datings often flew in the face of the archaeological evidence from Qumran and the paleographic evidence, the study of the ancient handwriting styles.
DuPont Summer, though, seemed less constrained by these potential biases.
He positioned himself differently. He even invoked the legacy of Ernest Renan, the famous 19th century historian of Israel and early Christianity.
Renan had noticed Christian-like themes in some of that intertestamental literature years before.
Exactly. And DuPont Summer saw himself continuing that Renanian tradition of historical inquiry. He identified as a perseverant, a pure scholar explicitly without religious affiliation.
Wilson asks, maybe only a secular scholar could really confront the full implications of the scrolls without those ingrained perspectives.
It's a provocative question. Now, Wilson does acknowledge that DuPont Summer's initial work, especially on the Habakkuk commentary, might have had a touch of sensationalism, maybe some speculative filling in of textual gaps.
But his impact was huge in bringing the scrolls to public attention, wasn't it?
Undeniably. His books were, for many people, the main way they learned about the significance of these texts. While other scholars had crucial insights, their work often stayed in more technical journals.
Like Dr. Brownlee's work on the suffering servant,
for example. But DuPont Summer's broader interpretations forced even initially critical scholars like H. Rowley or even Father DeVoe himself to eventually revise some of their positions. He really shifted the conversation.
Okay, let's circle back to one specific scroll, that small, unrolled one from Cave 1.
Ah, yes, the one that wasn't photographed initially. We only had a couple of detached fragments.
Written in Aramaic, nice handwriting.
Very clear and beautiful, yeah. And Dr. John Trevor managed to decipher a name from one fragment, Batinos.
Batinos, is that?
He linked her to the Book of Jubilees, an old apocryphal text. In Jubilees, Batinos is the wife of Lamech.
Lamech from early Genesis. And there were ancient lists mentioning a book of Lamech.
Exactly. Thought lost. Or maybe part of the Book of Enoch. So finding this name seemed like a huge clue. Maybe the scroll was the lost Book of Lamech.
They couldn't read any more at that point.
No, the scroll itself was tightly rolled and very fragile. The reading stopped there for a while.
The Metropolitan then took it to the Fogg Museum at Harvard.
Right. But they found this sticky, tar-like substance, basically gluing the layers together. A major problem for unrolling it.
And there were ownership issues, too. Jordan objecting.
Yeah, the political situation hadn't gone away. Who actually owned these scrolls was becoming a big question. Dr. Kraling stepped in with funds to keep it safe at the museum while things were sorted out.
But insurance was tricky.
Lloyd's wouldn't insure it easily. The Metropolitan ended up having to sign a waiver, releasing the museum from liability if anything happened.
And then he just took it back.
Apparently so. Seemed to abandon the Fogg's help. Wilson mentions him being frustrated with the American way of doing things, needing contracts for everything, unlike the verbal agreements common in the Middle East.
Though he found even contracts could be unreliable, citing that incident where someone took unauthorized photos of his other scrolls at the Oriental Institute.
Right. So that potentially crucial Aramaic scroll remained unread for quite some time due to fragility, politics, and these logistical issues.
Now, let's talk about G.R. Driver again. He didn't just argue for a later date. He challenged the whole Qumran as a Essene monastery idea, didn't he?
He did, quite directly. His book aimed squarely at refuting Father de Vaux's widely accepted theory.
De Vaux's theory being, Qumran was an Essene monastery, occupied from roughly the late 2nd century BC to 68 AD, and the scrolls were hidden in the caves to protect them from the advancing Romans.
Exactly. Driver proposed an alternative. The Qumran sect wasn't the Essenes, but some other group he called the Covenanters.
And his arguments.
He tried to reinterpret Pliny's Latin differently. He questioned why a sect that supposedly abjured war would need solid buildings. He even suggested the scrolls might be completely unrelated to the Qumran buildings.
This missed the pottery connection, too. The similar jars found in the caves and the ruins.
Called it pure coincidence, and argued the room identified by de Vaux as a scriptorium was too small to have produced hundreds of manuscripts.
All feeding into his attempt to date the scrolls later, pushing them past the time of Jesus and early Christianity.
Right. If they're later, they can't have influenced Christian origins.
But de Vaux pushed back hard.
Oh, comprehensively. In scholarly journals like Revue Biblique, he basically dismantled Driver's arguments piece by piece, pointed out inaccuracies, misunderstandings of the archaeology, even flaws in Driver's bibliography.
What were de Vaux' counter-arguments?
He reasserted the standard reading of Pliny's location for the Essenes. He noted the Roman military presence near Qumran, explaining the need for defense. He cited the arrows found at Qumran, the dating evidence from coins found there,
And the really crucial link.
the discovery of texts identical to Qumran scrolls found at Masada. Masada fell to the Romans in 73 AD. That provides a firm terminus antiquem, a date before which those texts must have existed. Driver's later dating just didn't fit that evidence.
Okay, so let's return to that unread Aramaic scroll from Cave 1, the one initially thought to be the Book of Lamech.
Right. When Israel eventually acquired the first batch of scrolls held by the Metropolitan, this was the only one still unread and unpublished.
Still in bad shape.
Very poor condition. That viscous substance, the brittle leather. Reading was tough because the ink hadn't held up well either. They had to remove some thin material covering parts of the columns, and the tops were decayed away.
But eventually they managed to read some of it.
Yes, in 1956, the Hebrew University published 5 somewhat legible columns, edited by Yigal Yadin Sikanik's son and Naaman Avigad.
And it turned out not to be the Book of Lamech.
No, it turned out to be an Aramaic retelling or expansion of the Book of Genesis, now known as the Genesis Apocryphon.
Interesting. So it followed Genesis closely sometimes.
In parts, yes. But in other parts, it resembled those other intertestamental books like Enoch and Jubilees, adding details, expanding stories.
How old was this particular copy?
Dated paleographically to the late 1st century BC or the first half of the 1st century AD.
And it had some unique takes on Genesis stories, like Sarah in Egypt.
Oh, yeah. The Genesis Apocryphon gives this much more elaborate, almost sensual description of Sarah's beauty, even though she was quite old by then. It's recounted by a courtier describing her to Pharaoh.
It really shows how fluid biblical storytelling still was back then, doesn't it? These texts weren't just copying, they were interpreting, reimagining.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating window into that process.
Now, we have to talk about John Allegro, a controversial figure in the Scrolls story.
Ah, yes. John Allegro from Manchester University definitely stirred the pot.
He had the credentials, right?
Right.
Scholar of the Old Testament, intertestamental studies, appointed to the international team.
Solid credentials. But his personality. Wilson describes him as irreverent, petulant sometimes, a real contrast to the typical reserved biblical scholar or a traditional English academic.
He had a background in ministry, but lost his faith.
Yes, Methodist ministry, which put him in a unique spot on that largely ecumenical committee of scholars, many of whom were clergy.
And his main source of controversy was
His tendency to run to the press and radio with sensational announcements about discoveries before they were properly studied and published by the team caused a lot of confusion and friction with colleagues.
De Vos didn't even cite Allegro's book on the Copper Scrolls, right?
Right. Wilson notes that de Vaux explained why elsewhere, hinting at deep disagreements.
And Allegro went hunting for treasure, based on the Copper Scrolls.
He did. He got funding from Manchester for an expedition to Jordan, trying to find the locations mentioned in those 2 strange copper sheets that list vast amounts of buried gold and silver.
But things went wrong. Accusations of unauthorized digging.
Big time. De Vaux accused him publicly of digging without permission at Qumran itself around old Jewish tombs in the Kidron Valley.
And near the Mosque of Omar. That's incredibly sensitive ground.
Hugely sensitive. The site of the ancient Jewish temple, sacred in Islam too. Allegro claimed he had permission from the mosque's guardian, but he was apparently stopped from digging on the esplanade. The army even had to intervene to stop his explorations elsewhere.
So what did the other scholars think of this Copper Scroll treasure? Real or fantasy?
Most of the team, particularly Joseph Milik, who is assigned to decipher the Copper Scrolls, leaned towards fantasy. Milik called it an attempt to document an Oriental fantasy, comparing it to works like the Book of Buried Pearls.
They argued the place names were too obscure, couldn't be identified.
Right, and that the sheer amount of treasure listed was just impossibly huge.
But Allegro believed it was real.
He argued passionately for its authenticity, pointed to the detailed, organized nature of the list, not like a random fantasy. And he cited the discovery of actual silver coins found hidden at the Qumran monastery ruins.
DeVos's accusation of Allegro eviscerating his soil and his walls, that really shows the anger over the unauthorized digging.
Yes, very strong language. As for the treasure's value, Milik thought it was implausible, but Allegro countered, quite reasonably, that we don't actually know the precise value of an ancient talent of silver or gold. He even used some funny examples from the New Testament about talent.
It's a real clash of personalities and interpretations around those copper scrolls.
A major clash, yeah.
Let's shift back to the impact of the biblical texts themselves. Finding Hebrew manuscripts older than anything known before, and sometimes different from the standard Masoretic text, that must have caused waves.
Oh, definitely. Wilson notes consternation among Orthodox Jewish scholars. The Masoretic text had been considered the definitive, almost perfectly preserved text for centuries.
And for Christian scholars.
The challenge came more from the unknown documents, the non-biblical scrolls that shed unexpected light on the world Jesus lived in, the emergence of Christianity from Judaism.
It highlights differences many people aren't even aware of, like the different order of books in the Jewish Tanakh versus the Christian Old Testament.
Right, and Wilson points out that, sadly, general Bible literacy was declining. Many people didn't know the Bible wasn't originally written in English, or understand the complexities of translation and textual history.
He tells that anecdote about the English lady translating the New Testament into an African language.
Yeah, as if the King James Version was the original. It shows a lack of awareness about how texts are transmitted and translated.
And the reaction to the Revised Standard Version in 1952 shows how strongly people felt about familiar translations, protests, book burnings.
Calling it the Bible of Antichrist. It illustrates how hard it is for some people to grasp the scholarly work involved in trying to determine the original text and its meaning, especially when it differs from a beloved version like the King James.
The KJV's literary beauty is undeniable, but it can overshadow centuries of scholarly progress in understanding ancient Hebrew and Greek.
Exactly. Wilson gives examples, like the coat of many colors. Modern scholarship suggests a different meaning for the Hebrew phrase. Teachers often had to actively counteract the KJV's influence to teach accurate biblical studies.
One specific challenge has always been Old Testament quotes in the New Testament, right? Prophecies about Jesus that don't quite match the Hebrew Bible.
A long-standing puzzle. People were asking about discrepancies found in scrolls near Jericho way back in the 9th century.
And scholars developed theories, like collections of prophecies.
Yeah, the idea of testimonia collections of prophetic texts. Some thought maybe Jewish writers used them. Others, like Burkitt and Harris, thought Christians compiled them specifically to argue with Jews about messianic prophecies, proving Jesus fulfilled them.
Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho shows this debate happening in the 2nd century. Justin actually accuses Jews of changing their scriptures.
It gets quite heated. The classic example is Isaiah 7.14, the Hebrew Alma, young woman, versus the Greek Septuagint's Parthenos version, a key point of debate about whether it applied to Jesus or maybe King Hezekiah.
Trypho even compares the virgin birth idea to Greek myths.
And we know later Greek translations of the Old Testament, like Theodotion's or Aquila's, sometimes seem to have an anti-Christian bias, translating things differently.
Another tricky one is Matthew quoting a prophecy about Jesus being called a Nazarene, supposedly from Judges, but it's not actually there in Judges 13.5 as cited.
Right. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was no hard proof these hypothetical testimonia collections actually existed to explain Matthew's citations.
Until Allegro found something in Cave 4.
Exactly. Document the 4 from Cave 4. It really looked like a type of testimonia.
What was in it?
It strung together Old Testament passages predicting a Messiah, or maybe 2 Messiahs, one priestly, one royal. But crucially, no mention of Nazareth, no specific details matching Jesus' life from the Gospels.
And the compiler wasn't afraid to tweak the text.
Not at all. They altered citations, even joined separate verses together, like linking a passage from Deuteronomy 5 about hearing God's voice with Deuteronomy 18 about God raising up a prophet like Moses to create a new, combined messianic meaning. It showed this practice was really happening.
Shifting gears slightly, let's talk about Masada. Its story provides such a dramatic backdrop to this whole period.
The fall of Masada in 73 AD, ending the first Jewish revolt against Rome, an incredibly potent symbol.
Eleazar's speech, urging mass suicide rather than capture by the Romans. It's chilling.
And we know the story mainly through Josephus, who got the account from 2 women and 5 children who hid and survived.
Yigal Yadin's excavations there in the 1960s were groundbreaking, weren't they? What did they find?
They uncovered Herod the Great's amazing palace villa complex, administrative buildings, hanging terraces, bathhouses, armories, storerooms, even a synagogue. Incredible preservation.
And evidence confirming Josephus' account of the siege.
Yes, signs of the final fire, coins dating right up to 72-73 AD. They found Jewish ritual baths, mikvahs, and significantly fragments of biblical scrolls inside the synagogue.
Including scrolls similar to Qumran texts.
Exactly. That discovery at Masada was vital for dating the Qumran material, proving those types of texts were in use before 73 AD.
And the human remains?
Skeletal remains of what are believed to be zealot defenders and their families were found, including some in the bathhouse. A very poignant discovery.
Yadin really connected Masada to modern Israel, didn't he?
Very much so. At a military ceremony there in 1967, he explicitly linked the ancient heroism of the Zealots to the resilience of the modern Israeli army. Masada shall not fall again became a powerful slogan.
Which brings us, unfortunately, to another conflict. The 1967 Six-Day War and its impact on the scrolls.
Yeah, that war had a huge direct impact when Israel captured the old city of Jerusalem on June 5th, 1967.
The museum holding many of the later scroll fragments, the Palestine Archaeological Museum, later the Rockefeller Museum, was right in the firing line.
It was being used as a Jordanian military strongpoint, so it became a key Israeli target.
It was captured the next day.
June 6th. Dr. William Dever visited shortly after the ceasefire. The museum was damaged, but the scroll fragments thankfully were found safe in a wall safe.
What about the copper scrolls?
The actual copper strips were in Amman, Jordan, so they weren't affected by the fighting in Jerusalem.
But other key institutions were hit? The École Biblique, the American school?
Yes, both sustained damage. The École Biblique, the French Dominican school where Deveau and much of the scroll team worked, was actually occupied briefly by Israeli soldiers.
What?
Jordanian forces were reportedly shelling from nearby, so the Israelis moved in. Some priests were even held as temporary hostages. The building suffered further damage from bombing after that.
But the scroll work continued afterwards.
Amazingly, yes. An agreement was reached fairly quickly for DeVox and his international team to carry on their work, under Israeli auspices now. The main immediate change was just the title of the publication series.
What about the people at the American school?
The director and his family had a harrowing experience, fleeing Jerusalem during the fighting. The U.S. consulate in Jordanian Jerusalem was also bombed. It was chaos.
And the ownership question resurfaced. The Palestine Museum had been nationalized by Jordan.
Right. So technically, before the war, the scrolls housed there were Jordanian government property. Now they were under Israeli control. It added another layer of complexity.
Initial news reports were confusing.
Very confusing. Some said Israelis occupied the museum and found fragments. Others said it was shelled and the scrolls might have been moved to Amman. Took time to sort out the facts.
Father DeVox regretted not being able to meet easily with Yadin during this time.
Yes, the political divisions had made collaboration difficult, and the war initially didn't change that, despite them now being in the same city.
And access remained an issue. An American director tried to get scholars into the École Biblique Library.
Yeah, tried to arrange access for foreign scholars, but was apparently denied, reflecting the lingering tensions.
But there was a glimmer of hope.
Yes, amidst all the disruption and tragedy, there was this sense that maybe, finally, Israeli scholars and the international team could actually work together on the entire collection, breaking down some of the old barriers.
Let's look at one specific text that Yadin described later, the Temple Scroll, particularly the part about the statutes of the king.
Ah, yes, a fascinating section. It starts by quoting Deuteronomy 17 about appointing a king.
But then it gets very specific about practical matters.
Immediately, it goes into detail about the king's royal guard, 12,000 men, 1,000 from each tribe, chosen for specific moral qualities. And then it lays out detailed mobilization plans.
Mobilization. Against what?
Against an existential threat, an enemy attack. The scroll specifies different levels of call-up based on the size of the invading force, calling up 1/10, then 1/5, 1/3, up to half the available manpower.
And Yadin saw a connection to modern events.
A striking parallel. He noted that these ancient mobilization phases closely mirrored the actual stages Israel went through, calling up reserves just before the Six-Day War in 1967. A personal, powerful observation for him.
So this scroll wasn't just about religious law. It reflected real-world political and military problems faced by ancient Israel.
Exactly. It feels very grounded in historical reality. Yadin contrasted it with the War Scroll, another famous Dead Sea text.
How so?
The War Scroll seems much more focused on a future eschatological end times battle between the Sons of Light and Sons of Darkness. It's more symbolic, maybe. The Temple Scroll statutes feel more like practical regulations for national defense.
Wilson also includes conversations with another Israeli scholar, David Flusser. What were his insights?
Flusser offered some really interesting perspectives on the religious and political climate, especially comparing Jewish and Arab viewpoints. He talked about the concept of holy war.
How did he frame it?
He suggested that, in his view, the Arab side still operated within a holy war framework, whereas Judaism had largely moved away from that. He also made a rather stark comment about Israeli military retaliations being the only language the Arabs understand.
It's a bleak assessment. Did he have a prophetic view too?
Somewhat. He noted how prophets throughout history always seem to be proven right about disasters. Then he gave this really eloquent comparison between Jesus and the teacher of righteousness from the scrolls.
What was the core difference he saw?
He saw the teacher of righteousness as focused inward on creating a small, perfect, elite community in isolation, viewing everyone outside as enemies. Jesus, in contrast, engaged with the wider world, even instructing followers not to resist Roman authority.
The kingdom of God is within you.
Exactly, that inward focus. Flusser also believed the teacher probably wasn't executed, unlike Jesus.
And he applied this to the modern situation.
He reflected on the Israeli Prime Minister Eshkol appealing to President de Gaulle of France for help before the '67 war. Flusser contrasted this reliance on earthly powers with how Jesus might have approached authority.
A unique perspective, coming from a Jewish scholar deeply familiar with both Jewish history and the New Testament.
Yes, offering insight into how Jesus might have navigated the conflict with Rome and, by extension, the complexities of the modern Middle East.
Wilson's own departure from Israel sounds incredibly tense. He was scheduled to leave just before the war broke out.
Yeah, May 24th. The U.S. consul was warning all Americans to get out immediately. The situation was deteriorating rapidly.
He had a final visit from Teddy Kollek, the mayor of Jerusalem.
Yes, Kollek, Moshe Perlman, and a former ambassador and his wife came to say goodbye, a poignant farewell under gathering storm clouds.
Wilson includes some nice anecdotes about Kollek, his down-to-earth style, always worrying about garbage collection even then.
Yeah, it gives a human touch amidst the high political drama. Perlman joking about Kollek's focus on garbage.
And there was a slight correction about Eshkol reminding de Gaulle of something. Shows how carefully language was being watched.
Every word mattered at that point.
The drive to the airport the next morning must have been nerve-wracking.
Palpable tension, Wilson says. The airport itself was chaotic. Throngs of people trying to leave, including visibly Orthodox Jewish men preparing for whatever might come.
Almost hysterical scenes at the Air France counter, both in Tel Aviv and then in Paris.
Just the sheer stress and uncertainty of the moment. He describes his relief finally getting on the plane.
And then, back in the U.S., he reads the news of the war unfolding.
Yeah. Follows the reports. Bombing near the American School, the Dormition Church, the Israel Museum, damage near the King David Hotel, casualties in Jerusalem.
Kollek trying to reassure people, Perlman back in his role as military spokesman.
The reality of the conflict hitting home. And the news about the Palestine Museum being nationalized by Jordan just before the war, adding to the uncertainty over the scroll's future.
DeVos's message for Yadin, regretting their limited chances to meet.
A sign of the fractured scholarly community at that moment, and the American director's failed attempt to get library access at the École Biblique.
But ending on that hopeful note, right? That maybe, just maybe, Israeli and international scholars could finally examine the whole collection together.
A hope born out of conflict, the possibility of collaboration emerging from division.
So looking back at this whole deep dive, it really is an amazing story, isn't it? Politics, religion, archaeology, all colliding.
Absolutely. We've seen how that intense 1947 Jerusalem atmosphere shaped everything right from the start.
And those first attempts to understand the scrolls, messy, conflicting, full of speculation, alongside genuine insight.
The Essene connection provides a powerful framework, even if details are still debated. And the potential of these texts to rewrite parts of religious history was clear almost immediately.
Then the 1967 war just adds another dramatic chapter, directly impacting the scrolls and the people studying them.
It really does.
So as we wrap up, maybe a question for you, the listener, to ponder. How different might our understanding of early Judaism and Christianity be today if the scrolls had been published quickly, openly, with less controversy?
Or maybe think about what this whole saga, the discoveries, the interpretations, the conflicts, tells us about how politics, faith, and the search for historical truth interact, sometimes uneasily.
These are big questions, definitely food for thought. And if you want to explore further,
There's so much. You could delve into the Essenes themselves, read more about that intertestamental period, look into specific scrolls like the Temple Scroll or the Habakkuk Commentary, or follow the ongoing debates in scholarship today.
because ultimately the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls isn't just about the past. It shows us how understanding that past gives us a richer perspective on where foundational ideas came from and how discovering history is often tangled up with the history being made right now.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel